All right, so today we're talking about 7 things that a judge who is biased against you can do that can lead to your wrongful conviction, right? Very important. It's one of those things that if you guys have listened to my content, you know kind of my position on this, and you understand that this happens, and it's actually considered the norm here in Utah. I don't know what it is elsewhere, but I know that I've talked to a number of defense attorneys. They talk about it very nonchalantly, like it's, that's just what it is, right? Judges favor the state. If you've been charged with something, it doesn't matter if you're innocent, right? Automatically, the judge is going to favor the prosecution. And that should be a major concern, right? It's one of those things where, I don't think the general public knows this. I think people in the industry know that, right? People in the legal industry. But it's disgusting, and it's got to change. And I think one of those ways is to just put it out there, right? And something's got to be done about this. So anyways, let's go ahead and get started though. So let's talk about 7 reasons, right? We're talking about 7 reasons. Let's start with number 1. So the number 1, and it's not the most important one, but it's just we're going to start there. One way that a judge that is biased, right, can affect your chances of getting a fair trial, and ultimately could through his biasness, right, it could lead to you being wrongfully convicted, is where at the preliminary hearing, right, the preliminary hearing stage, where this is the stage where the judge has got to decide what charges he's going to allow to be bound over for trial, meaning what charges are going to continue to trial and which charges are going to be just dismissed because there isn't enough evidence. So if a judge is biased, right, because this is a very discretionary thing, it's not binary, it's not like black and white, you know what I mean? A judge has tons of discretion as far as what charges he thinks meet that threshold to be bound over for trial, right? So anyways, at that preliminary hearing, if he's biased against you, right, he can go ahead and allow charges that are really unsupported, right, to continue. And it has an effect on everything. It has an effect on your ability to negotiate, right? If you're looking to negotiate because you are in fact guilty of something. And it has an effect on your ability, on the probabilities of you getting wrongfully convicted once you go to trial, because we know that juries like to convict. Anyways, and before I continue, one thing that I always like to make clear is, look, I'm not an attorney, right? This is based on my experience. It's not legal advice. I'm sharing this with you because I think it'll be helpful. Think it'll be helpful potentially to you, potentially to somebody you know and care about. And ultimately, right, the goal is that we bring about some positive change, right? The system has tons of flaws, and people get wrongfully convicted, more often than you think. The ones that you see on 2020 and Dateline that are exonerated, they're a small percentage of the people that are actually wrongfully convicted. I would argue, right, and this is just an opinion, I don't have facts and evidence to support this, but this is having been incarcerated for 12 years. I can tell you that I think most people that are wrongfully convicted, you don't ever hear about, right? So for everyone that you see on the news that's glorified, he got his conviction overturned and was innocent and is awarded $20-30 million or whatever ends up being. For every one of those, I would argue that there's probably 2 or 3 that are just sitting there rotting in prison and will probably never see the light of day, or if they do, it'll be years and years right down the line, and they're sitting there just miserable, knowing that they're innocent, but what are the chances you can do something, right? It's a subject for another video, but just once you're convicted, the entire machine, right? The entire machine is set up so that, and I mean the machine, I mean the entire system, right? The courts, the prosecution, the appellate system, everything, right, is set up to keep you convicted. It's not set up to go, hey, if you're wrongfully convicted, right, which is what we've all been fed. If you're wrongfully convicted, we have an appellate court. We have, procedures in place to make sure that wrongful convictions are overturned. That's a lie. It's all a facade. It's all designed to make sure that you stay convicted, right? That you stay convicted, you stay locked up. So anyways, let's get back to these 7 ways, right, that a judge's biased opinion or biased predisposition could lead to a wrongful conviction. So the second one is this, during jury selection, right? And this happened in my case. So there were some jurors, right? Jurors were given questionnaires. And I think that's typically done. In the questionnaires, some of the jurors made it clear they were biased. Some of them made it very clear they already thought I was guilty. They didn't like me because of this or that or whatever. And they were very open about it, you know what I mean? Some of them. And I remember that during the jury selection, my attorney pointed out, hey, judge, I don't think this juror should be allowed to continue, right? Shouldn't be part of the jury panel. They've clearly stated A, B, C, and that's going to hurt our client, and, we may not get a fair trial. But the judge would, sat there and fervently argued that that wasn't the case because he was biased. He wanted to see me convicted, right? So he didn't agree with my attorney. And I remember that at least a couple of the jurors that actually ultimately made it on my jury panel, there were some serious concerns. Like, these people had made it obvious. They weren't trying to hide that, that they were biased, that they were eager to convict me without knowing more. They made it obvious, and the judge allowed it. And that's the kind of, stuff that happens, right? Where if a judge is biased, he can easily just go ahead and allow a juror that is also biased to also proceed, right? As to be part of that veneer, that final veneer that gets to decide somebody's innocence or guilt. Yeah, and it's unfortunate, but it's one of those things that does happen. So that's number 2. The third thing is, when it comes to the third way that a judge who's biased could hurt you and could lead to a wrongful conviction, is where he gets to decide what jury instructions are given, right? So there's a certain number of jury instructions that are kind of standard, right? Everybody gets them. And then there's a bunch of jury instructions that have to be given, but the wording gets to be selected. The type of jury instructions, right, that are given are discretionary. So let's pick a specific example. So, and I'll use a simple one, right? So one that I'm familiar with. So let's say you were charged with first-degree murder. Underneath that, right, there's these affirmative defenses like, some self-defense, or, extreme emotional distress manslaughter, or imperfect self-defense. And if those jury instructions are given, what it does, it gives the jury the opportunity to convict you of something, that's less than first-degree murder. However, it's not automatic, right? The judge has to look at the facts of the case based on what he knows, based on what he saw, and he has to decide whether or not he thinks that there's the evidence that, that was presented, it was presented at trial, if that, justifies giving this jury instruction and that jury instruction. And that's where, it gets dicey, right? Because if you have a judge that's biased, well, he can just, right, because it's discretionary, he can say, no, I disagree. I don't think this jury instruction should be given, or this jury instruction should be given. And that hurts you big time. Because instead of being convicted, right? Let's say you did do something that was wrong. So instead of being convicted of a crime that leads to maybe a few months or a year or so or 2 years in prison, because that option was not given to the jury, right? You could end up just getting charged and convicted of the highest thing, right? Which could be, 10, 15, 20 years in prison, or the rest of your life in prison, right? So it's pretty important what jury instructions are given, and a judge that's biased could potentially hurt your ability, could deny your request for a jury instruction on a lesser crime, right? That's in that same kind of rubric of the law. So that's number 3. Number 4, very related. In fact, I already mentioned it. It's the wording of the jury instructions. That's something that's very contested. Like if you have a good defense attorney, he's going to want to make sure that jury instructions are given that are clear, concise, simple to understand. He doesn't want the jury confused. On the other side of this, the prosecution, there's always that possibility that they will try to, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, try to give jury instructions that will leave the jury a little puzzled or confused, or might, be so cryptic that that's just naturally what's going to happen, right? Whether or not it was his intention, and that gets argued, right? Before, that gets argued between the prosecution and the defense attorney before those jury instructions are given, and the judge ultimately has final say, right? He's got to decide, is he going to agree with the prosecution, or is he going to agree with your attorney, right? On the wording of that jury instruction. And if your judge is biased, well, he understands, right, that the more confusing the jury instructions are, chances are, right, based on human nature, and this is my opinion, chances are that there's a greater likelihood of you being convicted, right? Because how can a juror that thinks you're innocent, right, how can he convincingly argue his point on a specific jury instruction or element within, right, a jury instruction or whatever, if he's kind of puzzled himself, right? If he doesn't quite get it, right? In order for somebody to stand up for you and go, no, I think he's innocent, well, they got to understand like the basis for it, right? And the basis for it, it all lies on, it all falls back down to the jury instructions. And the jury instructions are based off of the statute, right? And based on a number of other things. But you see my point, right? So it would be very easy for a judge who is biased to favor the prosecution, right, when it comes to the wording of the jury instructions, and ultimately that could affect your ability to get a fair trial, could lead to your wrongful conviction. So that's number 4. So number 5, a judge also gets to decide what evidence comes into trial, right? The rules are vague. There's a lot of discretion. And sometimes, obviously, there's evidence that absolutely must come in. But it's not always that simple. Sometimes there's, little subtle little pieces of evidence could make a big difference in your case, huge difference in your case, but they're subtle. And the judge may or may not understand the significance. And your attorney may or may not properly argue to the judge, right, the significance of this evidence. And in my case, right, just, to share with you guys, there was a lot of those little subtle and some not so subtle pieces of evidence that never made it into trial. And most of the time, I'm trying to think here, most of those were actually because of my defense attorneys. The public defenders I had did not argue to get that evidence in. There was a couple, or maybe more than a couple, where it was the judge that decided that didn't come in. But it was evidence that could have really, because I understood the facts of the case, right? And I understand a little bit about human psychology. That could have altered the perception of the jury's their entire perception of the case, right? Could have changed the entire evidentiary picture, right? But that evidence never made it in. The jury never got to see that. So if you have a judge, right, that's biased, right, bringing it back home to the point that we're trying to make here, if you have a judge that's biased, where he can intentionally make the decision not to allow certain pieces of evidence in, evidence that could help you, evidence that would support your position that you're innocent, and that could have just huge impact, right? You could be wrongfully convicted just because this little piece of evidence didn't come in. And that little piece of evidence would have answered for the jury, right, that question that they had in their mind, right? Something that bridged this with that, right? Do you know what I'm saying? Like so there's sometimes in a case, right? And we all do this. We use common sense. And you're saying, well, wait a minute. If he's alleging this, right, if the defendant, if you're alleging this and this, well, your mind goes, well, wait a minute. But what about this, right? Whatever that is. It could be something that, that doesn't make sense, right? There's a missing piece. There's a question in your mind that does not get answered with the evidence that's presented that makes you look guilty. But had that little piece of evidence been allowed, right, by the judge, well, that would have answered the question. That would have removed all doubt, right, that you are innocent. That would have explained to the jury why you did that, why you did not do that other thing, or whatever, right? So it's huge. It's huge. And like I said, if you have a judge that's biased, he may do it intentionally or not intentionally. But if he decides to side with the prosecution, when the prosecution objects to you bringing in this little piece of evidence, that could have all the difference in the world. That can make all the difference in the world. You can end up wrongfully convicted, and it would have never happened had that come in. So anyways, I'm going on about this quite a bit because that happened quite a bit in my case. A lot of evidence like that never made it in. But like I said, most of the time it was my attorneys that didn't even make an effort to present that evidence. Number 6, the sixth way that a judge that's biased, right, could impair and hamper your ability to get a fair trial, could ultimately lead to your conviction, would be if, for example, during trials, right, and you see this a little bit on TV, but I don't think shows accurately reflect what actually happens in a court setting, right, in a trial setting. And it's because for the obvious reason, right, it wouldn't be as interesting, wouldn't make for a great movie. But there's tons of objections that take place. And that's what I'm getting at, right? There's a lot of objections. It's not just one or two or, at critical points. There's just tons of objections that get made during a trial. And every time an objection gets made, well, it's not automatic. It's not black or white, right? It's some of them might seem black or white, right? Depending on what the objection is. But generally speaking, the judge, it's discretionary, right? It's on a scale. And the judge has to decide whether or not he agrees or disagrees with each side. So if you have a judge that's biased, right, and that's number 6, well, he can decide to favor the prosecution and you object, and it could be for any number of reasons that your attorney objects, right? And he could just go ahead and favor the prosecution. And even if he only, for example, favors the prosecution 60% of the time, right? Not 100% of the time, but just 60%, right? That still has a huge impact, right? Because some of those, that 10% could have been some critical evidence, right, that was presented that should not have been presented, or vice versa, right? Or things that were said that maybe should not have been said, right? Or any number of things that come up during trial, right? So it's huge, right? It doesn't have to be like where the judge is 100% in favor of the prosecution. It could just be where he's not fair, he's not, impartial, and instead he's just 60%, just another 10%, right? Or actually 20%, right? Because if he favors the prosecution 60%, then he rules in your favor 40% of the time. So it's actually a much bigger difference there. But the point is that even a small bias in the judge's predisposition could have a huge impact in how he rules when objections come up. So makes a big difference. It also has an impact, right? If you think about it, if we take this even further, it has an impact on how the judge or how the jury perceives you and your case and your defense attorney, right? Because if the jury's watching this and your attorney keeps objecting and he keeps getting overruled, what does that do psychologically? Think about it, right? So the jury's already starting to also favor the state because it naturally happens. Unless your attorney, right, does some jiu-jitsu, right, some legal jiu-jitsu, and he's able to get the jury to empathize with him. But generally speaking, if he's not a master, right, at doing that, instead what it's going to look like, you're just pestering the judge and you're interrupting the flow. But in reality, your attorney is actually, making some legitimate objections. But because the judge is favoring the prosecution and keeps overruling your defense attorney, it makes it look like they're frivolous, like he's just trying too hard, and you're really guilty, but your defense attorney is just trying real hard, right? I'm sure you get the point that I'm trying to make here. So that's number 6. So number seven, the seventh way that a judge, and probably the most important one to some degree, or in some ways the most important one, the seventh way that a biased judge could lead to a wrongful conviction is where, let's say you have your trial, right? And your rights have been violated over and over. Objections have been overruled that would have, benefited you, but they were overruled, and the objections all went in favor of the prosecution. Evidence was presented that should not have been presented. Things were said that should not have been said. The jury should not have heard this or seen that or whatever, right? It just went all bad. Your attorney's last hope is to ask for a mistrial, right? He can ask for a mistrial. What that means is that he says, Your Honor, I want to a mistrial meeting. I want to start the whole thing over again, right? This trial was all bad, and I need to request another trial. Let's scrap this one and let's start from scratch. Nobody wants that. Not even the defendant wants that. So you understand that. It's not like this is something wonderful for a defendant, right? You have to start all over again. However, sometimes that's better than being wrongfully convicted of a life sentence, right? With a life sentence. So your attorney will ask for that, but if the judge is biased, he will deny it, assuming you have legitimate grounds. If he's biased, he can choose to deny it. It's not like your attorney, the defense attorney, gets to ask for it and it's automatically given. That's not the case. It's up to the judge. He gets to decide, do I want to grant the mistrial or do I not? And he can choose to, right? If he's biased, he can choose to deny the mistrial and allow the jury to deliberate, meaning to ponder on to decide, not just ponder, but ponder and decide on your guilt or innocence. And if if your rights were violated several times during trial, well, then there's a good chance, especially, if it's one of those cases where it just looks like you're guilty, right? Not that you're actually guilty, but it looks like that. And maybe some stuff came in that was baseless, right? But it still came in, right? Whether it was physical evidence or testimony that was just baseless, it could hurt your chances of being proven innocent, assuming you're innocent, right? Could lead to a wrongful conviction. So anyways, I hope this was helpful. These are 7 ways that I think that a biased judge could lead to a wrongful conviction. Some of these are based on, things that I lived, right? I experienced these. And some of these are based on things that I observed, helping other people out with their case while I was incarcerated, or through reading, thousands and thousands of cases. These are not the only 7 ways that a biased judge can lead to a wrongful conviction, right? There's other ways as well, but these are the top 7 that I came up with. Hopefully this was helpful to you or someone that you care about. Share this video with someone you know. It could help them, right? As they're getting ready to go to trial, especially if they're innocent. So anyways, see you in my next video. I'm not an attorney, and this is not legal advice.